Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Professor Koletzko. And we open now the ground for any questions.
Excellent presentation. I'm a neonatologist. I have a question. For preterm babies, we use formula which contain higher protein content. Does it predispose them to later obesity? And secondly, when should we switch to the low protein formula in these babies?
Thank you very much. That's an important question. In fact, we've known from many studies that the way we have been feeding preterm infants in the past makes them more obese. There is not a high body mass index, but there's a high body fat content in previously preterm born infants with increased hepatic steatosis, with increased muscle fat in adolescents up to adulthood. And we're very concerned about that. I don't think the solution to that would be to provide less protein than we have given in the past. The goal is to give as much protein as required by metabolic turnover for protein synthesis. If you look at the requirements of the preterm infants below 1,500 grams, and we want to match intrauterine growth, they have about 3 grams per kilogram per day of protein deposition. So we need to give to them, depending on the condition, 3.5 to 4 grams of protein per kilogram per day to match intrauterine growth. So while this looks like a paradox, less protein to the term, more protein to the preterm, it's in fact the same concept. Give the protein that meets metabolic requirements. The second part of the question is a more difficult one. How do we go down from the very high level to the lower level later on? It's a continuum. It depends on the rate of weight gain, on the rate of protein synthesis. So there is a continuous decline of protein requirements. The biggest challenge perhaps is the preterm infants that go home with a weight of 1,800, 2,000 grams, and they are fed at the breast, and they get a protein content that is clearly lower than the protein needs they would otherwise get if they were still in utero. So the question, I think, is how do we feed preterms best after discharge? Do we need to supplement them? And I think it's an open question, what is the best strategy here?
Yes, we have a question.
Bert, great talk. One question pertains to the measurement of cord blood metabolites. Given technologies and assessments, is it possible to differentiate what that relates to, maternal metabolism or placental metabolism? Are you able to do some differential studies to see what is the relative role of the placenta, particularly in things like IGF, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question, Zulfi. Thank you very much. Well, it's difficult to do that from the cord blood metabolites alone, but you can clearly look at the relationship between maternal plasma and cord plasma, and then try to draw some conclusions on to which extent maternal plasma composition predicts the cord plasma, and which factors or which metabolites are particularly influenced otherwise. We know that for some of these metabolites, placental transfer is very important. We have described transporters, for example, for DHA that preferentially transport DHA from the mother to the fetus, and we know that while maternal status is a predictor, an important predictor, this is very much modified by placental metabolism. For other metabolites, clearly there is a strong fetal component, the disappearance in fetal tissues. That's certainly true for glucose. It's true for other metabolites, for some of the amino acids more than others. It's a bit complex to try to come to these conclusions, but it's to some extent it's possible.
You sure? So,
yes, please.
So Bert, could you follow up on that? Because it does seem we have a lot of studies where we give DHA to mothers and we know there's more DHA in the cord blood, But what do you think is the paradox here that DHA is actually associated with lower birth weight in the non-essential fatty acid component of the cord blood?
Thank you, Susan, for that question. Well, if we look at the meta-analyses that look at the randomized trials providing DHA or control to pregnant women, and you have contributed to these studies with your fantastic KUDO study in Kansas, we see that overall there's a very marked effect of the omega-3 fatty acids in preventing early preterm births and in prolonging, to some extent, by just a few days, the total duration of gestation. And along with that, there's an increase in the birth size, in birth weight, birth length, head circumference, if you look at the meta-analysis data, which perhaps is to be expected with longer duration of pregnancy, less preterm births, you have a higher birth size. But it doesn't really answer the question whether there's a specific modulating effect on growth of the fatty acids per se. What I think these studies really also point to is a potential growth promoting effect of the omega-6 fatty acids, of arachidonic acid and perhaps linoleic acid, because they were positively related to the growth. And we know there's some metabolic competition here. And I think it's an important question to follow up further. There's so much excitement about DHA that people tend to lose focus on the fact that arachidonic acid is also an essential fatty acid that is incorporated in very large amounts in tissues before and after birth, including the brain. And we have a number of experimental data showing growth-promoting effects of arachidonic acid in cell culture. There's a few human studies. There's a preterm study by Sheila Innes. There's some other observations that have related arachidonic acid to growth. You have your own studies published many years ago where in preterm infants, high EPA that suppresses arachidonic acid was associated with less growth. So I think perhaps we should look at it from this point of view and really explore carefully what is the importance of arachidonic acid before and after birth for growth and health.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. I mean, obviously the arachidonic acid and the linoleic acid associated with higher growth in that metabolomic study, I think fits very much with what one would think. And you're right, maybe the non-essential fatty acids are really identifying those differences between the omega-6 and omega-3s. It's intriguing to see it that way.
Yes, please.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Berthold. We heard earlier some question and some consternation about the exclusively breastfed infant who becomes obese. And I wonder if this is this simply a volume issue? Are we talking here about the quality of protein or a failure in downregulation of the amount of protein provided in that mother's milk? Do we know?
Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you for that. First, I'd like to emphasize that this is the exception, not the rule. The rule is that breastfeeding is associated with less obesity. So let's not get confused. We still are enthusiastic about promoting, protecting, supporting breastfeeding for many reasons, and this may be one of the reasons. So in the few cases where we have high growth with exclusive breastfeeding, which is then attenuated after ending exclusive breastfeeding, after introducing mixed feeding or stopping breastfeeding overall, there is clearly an indication that breastfeeding is promoting high growth. You've seen from the data that Kim showed, there's some cases where there's very high volumes of breast milk taken, and you've seen the data that both Kim and I showed you where breast milk composition, particularly protein content, was predictive of high growth. So it may be both factors, maybe a combination of it. There's very few studies, we'd like to see more, that look at both volume and composition. We're involved in one study now in Asia where there's an attempt to measure breast milk consumption with deuterium, and we are collecting breast milk samples and try to measure the composition of the breast milk. So the hope is that there we could come to better conclusions if we have the absolute intake of substrate in exclusively breastfed infants and then relate that to growth.
Yes, Dr. Leila.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. Thank you. It's here. Yeah. So do we have a better answer now for the definition of rapid weight gain? You know, the classical teaching was like, we should 30 to 35 gram a day for a baby who's, growing the first few months. Then we start talking about different group of gain weight for small for gestation, premature babies, term babies. Is there a better answer for rapid growth weight in this population?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, obviously, the absolute weight gain changes markedly with the age of the infant. In the first months after birth, a healthy baby gains about 900 grams. After a few months, it gains only 200 grams a month. So the absolute number changes markedly per day. The classical concept is to look at percentiles and to look closely if children cross the percentile channel. But I think Michelle has very nicely pointed out yesterday that it is not normal to grow exactly on the percentile, but it's normal that growth fluctuates around percentiles. So just crossing a percentile by itself is not pathology. It maybe is a reason to look closely at the infant and to follow it up. And as Kim said before, it's a very difficult question if the baby is exclusively breastfed. We generally think we shouldn't interfere with exclusive breastfeeding. Maybe your thought of looking at the frequency of breastfeeding is interesting, but that probably deserves a study, because in older children we know that less feeding occasions is actually associated with more obesity. So just to reduce feeding occasions doesn't really guarantee that we have a beneficial effect. I think we should test that in a controlled trial to really come to firm conclusions.
We'll take one question from the... When does protein become an important factor for increased muscle? And between two brackets, in adults, we believe a high protein diet is good for weight loss.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Is the high protein diet in adults good for weight loss? Is that the question?
When does protein become an important factor for increased muscle in adults? We believe a high protein diet is good for weight loss.
Okay, so the first question is protein promoting muscle growth? And clearly, you need protein to grow muscle, but you need primarily physical exercise. If you have amino acids available during and after physical exercise, that will help to stimulate protein synthesis. But the hope that many of adolescents have to buy a big box of whey protein and to eat that and become a bodybuilder, that's probably not based on evidence, and it's probably better to invest your money in running shoes rather than buying protein supplements. The other question is protein helpful to lose weight? Is high protein fasting sensible? I think yes. The satiety effect of protein is greater than the satiety effect of carbohydrates and fat per kilocalorie consumed. And many people find it easier in adulthood to lose weight with high protein diet, with less carbohydrates, less fat. And it is another example for the wisdom that all pediatricians know, that infants are not small adults. The metabolic effects of protein in infants and adults may be different.
Okay, another, it's related to amino acids. Can you please elaborate if there is any range that amino acids, particularly leucine, when these amino acids have adverse effect? The range at which the adverse effects of amino acids?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question. I've shown you this breakpoint analysis, and it would seem prudent not to provide branched-chain amino acids in amounts that exceed plasma concentrations over and above that breakpoint, because it clearly is a signal that the infant metabolism is not capable of dealing with that well. The unresolved question is, below that breakpoint, do we have a continuous effect of the amino acids on growth, or is it non-continuous effect? Is there like a threshold effect at a certain concentration? And I don't think we know that.
Is it only the diet or other factor that is responsible for abnormal growth and patterns? Example, epigenetic, etc.
The answer is yes. Like everything in biology, nothing is monocausal. There's always a number of factors, and for growth, clearly, we know there's a lot of effects, and this whole area of epigenetics is exploding with the new technology. Now we can get much more data collected. The big challenge is the data analysis. But for example, in our studies, we find that epigenetic markers are associated with body fat content of the children, that the epigenetic markers predict body fat deposition. The question we don't know is whether it's causal or whether it's an epiphenomenon.
Okay, and again about protein, what's your opinion about high protein and growth of premature neonates?
Yes, as I said before, I think we must supply to preterms, or must strive to supply to preterms, the protein needs that would match intrauterine protein accretion and synthesis, and that's challenging. We can't do it with mother's own milk alone. We need to fortify mother's own milk. And in fact, many of the conventional fortifiers probably have less protein than we would like to see for the small preterm infants. We need, in most of the small preterm infants, parental amino acids early on. And in the preterm formula, I think also we would like to see more preterm formula with a higher protein content. Near 3.8 gram of protein per 100 kilocalories is probably a goal we would like to get close to. And many of the preterm formulas don't have that yet.
Yes, please.
Hi. Two questions. First, in your studies where you've fed the formula with different protein intakes, you presented BMI data. Does that translate into differences in fat, or do you have body composition data to go along with that? And then secondly, also in the same studies, to what extent could some of this effect be mediated through maybe programming effects on total intake? Are there differences in total energy intake as a result of this? And in fact, what you're seeing is a programming effect on appetite.
It's an excellent question. That was actually one of our initial hypotheses, that if we gave more protein to an immature infant with an immature renal concentration capacity, we would potentially have an effect on excreting more water, inducing thirst, inducing more volume intake thereby. And then there's the other hypothesis that Kim alluded to on specific amino acids being important for regulation of satiety and appetite. We don't see anything of that. We looked at the volume intake of the energy intake. It's basically identical in the two randomized groups with the two different protein intakes. There's one time point at 6 months where there is a statistical significance because more than 1,000 infants, but it's actually biologically probably irrelevant. If you look at the two curves of energy intake, they're basically the same from birth to early childhood. There's no effect on energy intake. So that's interesting that we have a different body size, a different body composition also at the same energy intake. And it raises a lot of question on the metabolic regulation. With respect to body composition, yes, we have data to show that the higher protein content does not support more lean body mass, but induces significantly higher body fat mass at 2 years and 6 years of age. The babies become fatter with more protein in infancy. The manuscript, I hope, will finally be published now. We had a lot of questions arising from the reviewers. It was going around in circles forever, but I hope the data will be out soon.
So I'll follow up on that, though. So going back to the studies we did back, and I think Kim alluded to, showing that the infants who are fed the formula actually are leaner at 4 and 6 months than the breastfed. So what you're saying then is that after that, is there a deceleration in the rate of lean gain, or how do you explain what happens after that?
Yeah, we see similar things. We see time-dependent effects. We see higher body fat content, for example, at 2 years and at 6 years, a significantly higher fat content, but that's different from the early observation at 3 months, 6 months, what have you. A predictor is weight gain velocity. We looked in a subgroup at body composition with deuterium-labeled traces, and we find that body fat content in infancy is closely related to weight gain velocity. So more rapid weight gain is a strong predictor of body fat deposition, and that's perhaps to be expected. It's, again, this issue that people have said, okay, the baby is small, just push feeding, give it a lot of energy, make the weight go up quickly, and the only thing you achieve by a rapid weight gain velocity is fat deposition. You can't push lean body mass deposition that way, and that's basically what we see as well. So again, it's an important message to take home for practice in clinical pediatrics. If the baby is small and the grandmother says, give it some more, make it look like the neighbor's baby very quickly, it's probably not a good idea to push the weight gain fast.
Okay, allow me to ask the last question before we close this wonderful session. Do you advise, as we are speaking about metabolic regulation of infant growth, do you advise the use of probiotics in extremely low premature babies, especially with the theory of microbiome? And
thank you for that question. It's a very hot topic. The microbiome is really an exciting area of research and metabolic regulation, and as I said, clearly our plasma metabolites are influenced by gut bacteria. There's a lot of data on that. With respect to microbiota and infant growth, I don't think there's convincing evidence so far that provision of so-called probiotic bacteria changes infant growth. At least I'm not aware of it. I'm not on top of the information, perhaps. With respect to the preterm infant, the excitement is more about prevention of necrotizing enterocolitis, but it is also a question on how much necrotizing enterocolitis we have. In our unit, it's very much the same experience that you have shared from this part of the world. We haven't seen any case of necrotizing enterocolitis for the last few years in our neonatology, so we don't see any reason to give probiotics to our preterms because we can't reduce anything further beyond what we achieve with promoting human milk feeding in the preterm baby. So there's a lot of debate on the role of probiotics. There's a lot of meta-analyses. There's less clean studies with single strains, and I think many of us are still torn between the arguments on what to do. I would say we should probably invest in understanding more the complexity of the gut bacteria and the many influencing factors, and should not forget that diet is a key predictor of the gut microbiome, and explore the complexity more and not just look at a single strain, one capsule a day, one strain a day, changing the world. The biology may be a little bit more complex.
thank you very much, Professor Koletzko. It was a wonderful session.